Welcome to the stage of history! Are 6 words I've wanted to shout down the side of a mountain since plopping this game in for the first time on 9/9/1999. Though Soul Calibur never really seemed to take a place in mainstream Americana's heart like Street Fighter and Smash Brothers have, they used to be a really big deal as tech demos. More for animation fluidity and character fidelity than anything else, but in my experience, what made them such a big deal was that unlike most fighting games, Soul Calibur usually gives you a few really fun single-player modes. And half of that fun was stretching the limits of a purportedly historical setting that really transcends history and the world to bring us a tale of a magical sentient demon sword that turns people into vampires and opens up a portal to a psycho-mental hell realm fought over by women in their underwear who slice each other's brains out with weapons that don't kill each other? Elvis! If you'd like to let me know how aware you are of how much nonsense these games are, then please spam the following comment below. You know what's not nonsense, though, is knowing the real-life historical context that leads to what we more often than not label as pop culture nonsense. So, here we go. What did Namco get most hilariously right and wrong here? What's the real historical context behind the fantasy historical context? How did we, as a society, end up here in the first place? The answers may surprise you. So for Soul Calibur 6, the menus in the game finally nail down a specific year all this stupid stuff is supposed to happen. 1583. So what was going on in the world in 1583? Well, for starters, the world's largest population would have been in China or India, just like today, but the world's largest economic and military power would have been the Spanish monarchy headed by King Philip II. To speak in general, for the 600 years before 1583, which is going back from the time of Julius Caesar to the time of Leonardo da Vinci, Europe's economic and political nerve center would have usually been some city in what would become Italy. And the 1500s was the first century that saw Italy's preeminence over the rest of Europe finally, permanently shift away. The development of global trade networks advantaged Atlantic and Pacific empires rather than Mediterranean ones, and after centuries of catching up to population levels from before the Black Plague of the 1300s, the various monarchs leading modern-day France, Spain, and England were using the productivity and tax revenue of that population boost to fund voyages of discovery and exploration. Before industrialism, before the masses were capable of cranking out cratefuls of commodities cheaply by the hour, the merchants, leaders, and thinkers of the medieval European mercantile mindset were operating under the prediction that only a finite amount of wealth would ever be generated by mankind on planet Earth, and that it would have to be generated very slowly and very miserably at that. Oh, and yeah, killing your neighbors over denominational religious intolerance was way more normal back then. Basically, you had a world full of states whose leaders genuinely believed that it was their moral responsibility to take as much wealth as possible. So while this period may be called the Age of Discovery, the Late Renaissance, or the Age of Exploration, let's curb the romanticism and be realistic. If you rolled the dice and happened to be born 400 years earlier, you statistically weren't likely to make it to the age of 5. And if you did, you'd likely be working 14-hour days in miserable conditions as the same exact kind of human being, but as an entirely different personality. Without the ability to read, without public education, one with little to no knowledge of medicine, history, and the outside world in general. In England, literacy rates hovered around 15%, and 12% of children didn't make it to the end of their first year, which brought average life expectancy down to the age of 40. And this is with Europe recovering from the quote-unquote Dark Ages, the very real decline in safety, health, wealth, physical infrastructure, and bureaucratic infrastructure among the former Western colonies of the Western Roman Empire, while the Eastern Roman Empire on the way to Eastern Europe did continue to exist fine for like a millennium. While the Islamic caliphates were going through a golden age, heavily patronizing scholars developing math, astronomy, and physics, and the spread of those ideas would spark the Renaissance back in Western Europe, leading to the incentive to further trade east, which led to the expensive voyages that romanticizes Soul Calibur's setting as an age of discovery. Meanwhile, in Asia,
my country, the Ming Empire, you know it, right? It's going through some hard times. Violence is the norm. In the hope of saving our land, the Emperor asked me directly to search for the hero's sword.
Many historians claim that the Ming Empire of China was the world's largest economy throughout the 1300s and 1400s. and also one of the world's largest and most advanced navies during the time, one that would have rivaled Spain's. Fun thing to think about, though, is that they didn't use the fleet for conquering in the name of Christianity more so than for coercion in the name of Confucianism. These ships were used to collect for a tributary system that had the Chinese exchanging gifts with societies along the Indian Ocean and eastern coast of Africa. But during Soul Calibur's century, the current Ming Emperor's court was succumbing to infighting. They made some bad deals with the Europeans that depleted their silver reserves, thus popularizing paper currency, which did not stop the inflation that was keeping taxes unaffordable for the peasants. The farmers were suffering from natural disasters, so they organized a 10-year-long peasant rebellion that managed to capture Beijing, and then Beijing got taken again a year later by the Qing dynasty. Which would have been a good lifetime after this game's events, but the infighting, the conflicts between the emperor and his court that is associated with that decline, was underway by the 1580s. In retrospect, her comment towards violence being the norm does seem like an exaggeration, considering that most of that civil warring was happening in the 1640s. Weird thing is, though, despite peasant rebellions and civil wars and dynastic takeovers, if you happened to be born 400 years earlier than today, you'd still probably be rolling for a higher statistical chance of having a better standard of living in Ming China than if you ended up in the Azuchi Momoyoma period in Japan, when the island was still split up into warring shoguns. Oda Nobunaga's ambition to unify Japan failed because of betrayal, but the next most powerful daimyo in line who managed unification then made it harder for everyone to quit their jobs, then he led an invasion into Korea that failed, then he invaded again and failed again, then he crucified the Christians. 30 years later, Japan decides to just not interact with the outside world at all for 250 years. But a century earlier, which is still a surprisingly recent time in the grand scheme of things, in 1470's Okinawa, we can see the real genesis of Soul Calibur begin. In 1477, the Okinawan king seized everyone's weapons, so its noble scholars, who had the free time to practice martial arts and the need to protect themselves, even when in court, developed new martial arts out of Chinese books imported in the earlier century. These early karate experts developed routines called kata, in which deliberate body movements would carefully transition one defensive posture to the next, occasionally sneaking extensions of the performer's limbs in and out, using movements versatile and distracting enough to improvise strikes into them. A kata is a training method, a pre-scripted martial arts dance routine drilled into students from shared repetition so they could execute it on muscle memory, using their more immediate mental faculties to strategically transition those moves into strikes for the unpredictability of a real fight. And the unlockable katas in the first 3 games, which were driven by a cutting-edge passive optical motion capture animation system that smoothly transitions every fighter's moves into the next, truly illustrates the marriage between the history, culture, and technology that humans combine together to create art. And Soul Calibur is no exception.
美しき中国武術家本物の動きが今ここに超リアル武器格闘ゲームソウルキャリバー
And though East met West from day one in this series, that cultural context explains why the history of Soul Calibur's Japanese characters is played far straighter than its European characters. Even someone as zany as Yoshimitsu is based on multiple aspects of Japanese history. He shares a name with the real-life shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, whose relations with the Chinese have labeled him a traitor by the rest of Japan. This has created a legacy of the name Yoshimitsu being associated with betrayal in Japanese media. And the Yoshimitsu of Soul Calibur has a questionable backstory full of friends and lords betraying him. Also, his costumes are typically the most period accurate out of the whole cast. And even someone like Taki has a historical analog here, because sexy female ninjas are believed to have been a real-life phenomenon. Thanks to the 17th century Book of the Ninja, the Banzen Shukai, mentioning that women were employed as ninjas, covering as maids to spy against, though not exactly fight or assassinate, their employer's enemies. While the Banzen Shukai is a primary historical source, the questionable life of Mochizuku Chiyome, a late 16th century Japanese noblewoman whose very existence is disputed, inadvertently created the archetype of the sexy fighting kunoichi you see all over video games and anime. A 1970s book speculated that this woman lived a double life as a spy master of a clan of all-female ninjas who used cover jobs as courtesans and performers, rather than maids, to assassinate lustful male targets. These stories make for a hell of a lot more fun fiction than fact, as does Taki's tight spandex costume, which wouldn't have even been possible until the 1950s. Well, the chemical polymers needed to make spandex would be invented in the 1950s. Before then, tights were made out of wool, and Japan did not start farming sheep until they opened the borders in the later 1800s. And though her supernatural demon-hunting Fuma ninja clan shares a name with a real-life Fuma ninja clan, the real one specialized in horseback guerrilla warfare, not demon slaying. But no Soul Calibur character is more immersed in real-life hard Japanese history than Mitsurugi. Mitsurugi's home stage in Soul Blade is a supposed pirate base housing the real-life Murakami samurai clan that operated as pirates and, in the fiction of the game, trained him in swordsmanship. His stage in Soul Calibur is the real-life siege of Takamatsu Castle as it's happening, with the fort being flooded by the same guy who would later try to do 2 fruitless failed invasions into Korea. In fact, Mitsurugi's entire character is based on the real-life swordsman Miyamoto Musashi, a traveling ronin who killed tens of people while either working as a mercenary or when participating in his 61 undefeated duels. He famously would use wooden swords and staffs and still win, perhaps sparking Soul Calibur's idealism of equally matched weapon masters that can make a staff withstand the blows of a heavy axe. But unlike Mitsurugi, I couldn't find any claims that the real-life Musashi ever traveled outside of Asia, which was not strikingly rare at the time. Japanese isolationism hadn't yet officially begun, and Japanese pirates were pillaging the contested waters of East Asia, all of which gives cause to the plausibility of a Japanese naval mercenary like Mitsurugi being able to freely travel the world and go on all sorts of wacky adventures. Which actually did happen to at least 2 Japanese individuals known only by their baptismal names of Christopher and Cosmos, the first Japanese people to cross the Pacific. Their employment on these voyages was recorded by an English captain they sailed with, eventually ending in a shipwreck off the coast of Brazil. So, Yoshimitsu is basically a period-appropriate military samurai who's a crazy fictional demon under the mask. Taki is a sexy female ninja based on circumstantial rumors of sexy female ninjas made shameless enough for the 21st century. While Mitsurugi is a barely flashy, surprisingly grounded analog to a real-life traveling ronin who has grown into a kinda national legend. That contextual inspiration, but not exactly historical accuracy, is what happens when fantastical ideology and real-life representation meet in historical fiction. The further away you get from Japan, the farther these character analogs start to stumble and tumble. Even with other Asian characters like Talam from the Philippines, who does represent a mishmash of modern Filipino cultural references, but doesn't personify a specific historical figure, nor the 16th century in Filipino history. Nunchaku did indeed come from the Ryukyu Islands, and so did Maxi. In fact, they were actually used to practice karate by the Okinawan nobles in history. Today, there's this whole subculture of Japanese Elvis fans that inspired Maxi's early costumes, and that began in the 1970s by neo-rockabilly bands coming out of Tokyo instead of from Okinawa. But what about the European characters? In the interest of fascinating the primarily English-speaking audience of this video and of myself, here's a rundown of the context inspiring some recurring souls who represent the other side of the commonly understood yet abstractly imagined border between Asia and Europe. As a Greek woman in the 16th century, Sophitia would have technically been living in the Muslim Ottoman Empire, after Greece was previously ruled by the Christian Orthodox Byzantine Empire. While some Byzantine scholars noted that cults of ancient Greek paganism still existed in the country up to the 9th century, over the next 700 years those small pockets likely would have been converted out by both the Christians and then later the Muslims. Even though nowadays there is a Hellenism revival movement, some members of which claim their families never stopped worshipping these gods across such a massive span of time. Why is the religion of this area so important to Sophitia?
Sophitia.
Sophitia? Because somehow, after 1,000 years of pagan persecution, she's an Athenian-born devotee of Hephaestus, the ancient Greek god of metalworking. Hephaestus appears to Sophitia and inspires her ancient-themed character design and the construction of her stage's temples through some completely fictional divine intervention magic. During Hephaestus's time, though, it was actually not rare to see women warriors in the more matriarchal societies that existed in the steppes to the east of Greece, such as the women soldiers of the Sarmatians, who would later go on to inspire the legend of the Amazons. or the women of ancient Sparta, who were expected to be trained for strenuous physical activity, which could include combat sports like wrestling and fencing, by almost every single Spartan parent. Though Spartan women could not serve in the Spartan military, it was not rare to see Spartan women fencing for sport, performance, and protection, not unlike Sophitia herself, though, they were hardly egalitarian by modern standards. The idea was that strong fighting females would give birth to strong fighting males, and for Spartan wives to protect themselves and run the place while the men were away. So all that would have depended on which city-state Sophitia would have happened to be born in, which unfortunately for her is Athens. While Spartan women enjoyed some rights, Athenian women were repressed to the point of rarely being seen in public. This unfortunately makes Sophitia's backstory both chronologically and geographically inconsistent. If only this line said Sparta, or the nearby city of Mistress, I guess, which was where the population was during the 1500s, her character's revival of some of those ancient values would make actually a lot more sense. Though she's still about 1,000 years out of her time, and these Japanese developers likely didn't care to comb through the cultural minutiae of each individual Greek city-state, and those Spartan women exercising in these windy, loose-fitting chiton robes were written about by smitten Roman poets even back then, Sophitia's bust size, in Soul Calibur 4 especially, would likely not have been considered attractive by the ancient Mediterraneans. In modernity, her design is more informed by the 1980s Namco video game of Valkyrie no Boken, Toki no Kagi Densetsu, and a character named Ki from the Tower of Juraga. Voldo is the sworn guardian of the Money Pit, an Italian treasury belonging to his merchant master that, in most of these games looks less like a medieval Italian treasury than it does a sewer. Anyways.
But during his quest, Verci learned his entire fortune had been lost in the chaos of a war that broke out in Italy.
The war they're referring to is a series of conflicts called the Italian Wars, when the kings of mainland Europe were apparently still obsessed with the idea of invading Italy and sacking Rome even as late as the 15th and 16th centuries. Which is actually confirmed in an official art book, and so is the explanation behind Voldo's blatantly bondage-themed costume, to reflect his submission to Verci. Even though the gay leather bondage S&M culture that would have put together a costume like this wasn't really a thing until the late 1940s, and romanticizing the submission of one sexual partner to another didn't become popular until the mid-1800s, and the daggers that make up his weapons are from Asia, not Italy. Though it should be clear to anyone reading this backstory that Voldo was obsessively in love with Verci, this would have been a secret they would have had to keep to their graves. Half a century earlier, the Roman emperors themselves were marrying men, but homosexual relationships were punishable by public execution in 1580s Italy. Voldo's feelings for Verci would have been a secret they'd have to guard with their lives, which, true to his character's theming, Voldo spends his life protecting. And he does this with this wacky, jumpy, rolly, back-breaking contortionist fighting style that is half pure fantasy and half happy accident with what was going on in Brazil at the time. In the late 1500s, no less. Brazilian slaves looking to escape were developing fighting styles not dissimilar to Voldo's. Martial arts that involved staying low to the ground, sometimes breaking out into an entire crawl before attacking on the rise upwards. Practice sessions for these martial arts had to be disguised as dances, which meant they looked cool as hell, which meant they only grew more popular with history. The danceable duality of capoeira,
capoeira, okay? Capoeira.
Has made it a popular choice for both Brazilian martial artists and street performers.
My father's killer, so we meet again.
Admit it, we are the same.
Siegfried Stauffen is a German warrior who shares much of the moveset and sometimes the same character slot as Nightmare, a monstrous demonic form of Siegfried that wreaks general havoc across Europe with the titular Soul Edge. In earlier games, before his armor started growing crystals and such, his costume may well still be the second most period-appropriate armor next to Yoshimitsu, though the decades of the later 16th century that this game explores would have seen full suits of plate armor like this and fighting with melee weapons in general start to go away. And of course, actual German Zweihander swords sure as hell don't look like the straight-up rock that Guts and Cloud were wielding around the same time in the 90s. Another possible inspiration is the character of Hyunkel from an early 90s Dragon Quest manga, also a knight of Western-influenced costume who also wields a giant sentient magical sword that looks not like a sword at all. Anyways, in real life, there is a Siegfried in German folklore, which itself is a German version of the hero Sigurd from Norse folklore, who undergoes a transformation after slaying the dragon Fafnir, which actually does happen to our Siegfried in a Wii spin-off called Soul Calibur Legends. After slaying the dragon, the Sigurd of Norse legend grows superhuman strength and horn-hard skin, which creates a tragedy of overconfidence as he goes on increasingly bold adventures until a queen he deceived from earlier orders a friend to stab his one weak spot with a spear, and the Germans must have thought bow and arrows are scarier, I guess. In Soul Calibur, Siegfried is the leader of a band of thieves who rob knights returning home from the Crusades, which were happening hundreds of years earlier. Soul Blade's instruction manual from 1995 mentions the Crusades, and then the in-game material kind of shies away from ever mentioning them again. Anyways, Siegfried goes mad when one of their raids ends with him accidentally killing his own father, leading him to take on the evil sword and transform into a scarier, crazier version of himself with a big claw, all of which doesn't end well for anyone. While the parallels with the Siegfried legend are loose, they do share the same names and a theme of tragedy and bodily transformation following the slaying of a monster. While the parallels with the Siegfried legend are loose, they do share the same names and a similar structure of a big battle event transforming Siegfried into a seemingly unstoppable version of himself, defeated only by one intimate weakness. Of course, it's the magical eyeball demon sword that is totally responsible for the demonic transformation itself. His madness begins with a much more mundane murder. Which begs the question, who is the Fafnir of Soul Calibur Siegfried's story? Did his transformation into nightmare begin when Siegfried slayed his father, or when he slayed the undead pirate of Cervantes de Leon? Cervantes de Leon is supposed to be a Spanish pirate, even though he speaks English with what is an audible imitation of a West English accent that has become its own pirate accent.
Answer me. Who am I?
You're our captain, the great pirate Captain Cervantes.
And what was the creed of the great pirate Captain Cervantes?
Anyone who talks like a pirate isn't actually talking like a pirate. They're impersonating Robert Newton from the 1950 Treasure Island movie.
You're a good man, Doctor. I've never seen a better. And I'd hate to see the likes of you skewered on the end of a pike.
In Soul Blade, Cervantes' costume is rife with gear that would have been more appropriate 200 years later. The frilly shoulder epaulette starts with frilly shoulder ribbons in the late 1600s, which is a fashion they rewind to for the next game, but this distinctive cravat on his puffy pirate shirt is also showing up about a century ahead of schedule. But oh my god, look at the sheer overcompensation on this guy's hat! During this era, Spanish soldiers were wearing circular hats, but they were folding them up into triangles to keep them from bumping into stuff. So all these gorgeous tricorn hats weren't a thing until the late 1600s to the early 1800s, and I'm gonna keep my fingers crossed. So what's his secondary costume? In Soul Calibur 1, it's Griffith. Another bit of Berserk is showing up again. Oh my god, so is Nightmare's secondary. A lot of Soul Calibur 1 has a ton of Berserk in it. Anyways, now, regardless of the historical uniform and the historical accent, piracy basically crops up throughout history wherever and whenever the rewards of robbing boats outweigh the risks. It's never really gone away. But the golden age of Caribbean piracy that we know and love so well is only so popular because the colonial navies at the time, the authorities who would later boot out the corrupt governors and patrol ships around to police the place, were currently busy with war. Owing to piracy's historical popularity is the fact that Cervantes is one of two pirates in Soul Calibur. Maxi is representing the East Asian piracy around Japan and China that was also popular in the 16th century. But apologies to the both of them. The real hotspot for pirates during this era was the Barbary coast on North Africa. And just like the Atlantic sea trade that would develop over the next century, the Barbary piracy of the 16th century centered around a slave trade, a long-lasting reality of recent history that is too unflattering and still too soon soon to even get a goofed mention in an old instruction manual. Regardless, slave ships were popular targets for pirates, because the human beings inside were the most valuable commodity of their time. Slaves could also turn into future crew members, and slave ships, well, they could fit a lot of crew on them. In fact, Blackbeard's first captured ship and cargo was the Queen Anne's Revenge. When the original Captain Morgan was commissioned by England to lead a pirate invasion of Panama, his provisions included an insurance policy for injured men. They could get paid in either gold coins or human slaves. But despite the anachronism, Cervantes' backstory of taking up the pirate life after seeing his father's ship destroyed in the service of the Spanish crown does reflect a dissatisfaction with the low pay and strict rules of the naval lifestyle that did spawn the careers of many real-life pirates. Many pirates were deserting sailors and captured sailors, and even some freed slaves, but most were disillusioned naval sailors who, despite the robbery and the slave trading, accidentally managed to tap into a general dissatisfaction with authority that would become popular over the next 2 centuries. And now they're considered fun characters for children, because of an adaptation of a historical fiction book that, in protest of the realism at the time, was deliberately written to be more charming and adventuresome than the realities of history ever were. Pirates, as we know them today, are anachronistic stereotypes, one that's only slightly less carefree with the details than the rest of this whole series, but coming from a completely different place. One where giggling at the absurdities of everyone's costumes and languages have always been half the fun. But you gotta wonder how much of that was intentional. This tale of swords and souls is supposed to be eternally retold, but not unlike history itself, each new version takes a step further away from the original, further developing its own timeless reality that only ever existed in the games themselves, which are, as are all artifacts, only capable of depicting their fleeting, temporary perception of their perceived present.